My family's betrayal was a quiet, polite affair, concluded over dessert. I arrived at my parents' sprawling Connecticut home with a sense of impending dread, the kind that settles in your bones and refuses to be dislodged by reason or false hope. The air was thick with the cloying scent of my mother's prized roses and the unspoken tension that had characterized our family gatherings for as long as I could remember. Everyone was there, dressed in their subdued, expensive casual wear, the kind that whispers of old money and quiet judgment. My brother, Daniel, was holding court in the living room, his laughter a little too loud, his gestures a little too broad. He was the sun around which our family orbited, and he basked in the warmth of their unquestioning adoration. I, on the other hand, had always been a distant moon, cold, self-sufficient, and largely ignored. The reason for this summoned convocation was no secret. My father had been hinting for months about getting his affairs in order and securing the family's future. I expected little. My life had been a lesson in managing expectations where my family was concerned. I had built my small tech consulting firm from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks, while Daniel flitted from one half-finished artistic endeavor to another, funded endlessly by our parents. My success was met with a polite, detached acknowledgement. His slightest interest in anything was celebrated as a monumental achievement. As we moved to the dining room, the grandeur of the table, the polished silver, the delicate china, felt like a stage set for a play whose tragic ending I already knew. The meal was a tortuous parade of forced small talk and veiled barbs. Just as the coffee was being served, my father tapped his fork against his crystal water glass. The gentle chimes silenced the room. My mother sat beside him, her face a mask of serene satisfaction that made my stomach clench. He began with a speech about legacy, about the importance of family unity, and ensuring that our values were preserved for generations to come. He spoke of love and responsibility. With every word, the knot in my stomach tightened, and then he delivered the blow. With a smile, he announced that he and my mother were entrusting the entirety of their estate, the house, the investments, the stocks, the entire fortune, to Daniel. The word entirety seemed to echo in the sudden silence. My ears buzzed. I felt the blood drain from my face. I managed to stammer out a why. My father looked at me, his expression not unkind but utterly dismissive. Daniel has a more fragile spirit, he explained, as if discussing a rare piece of porcelain. He needs the security. He has grand visions for his life, and this will allow him to pursue them without the harsh pressures of the world. My mother nodded, reaching over to pat Daniel's hand. He has such beautiful plans for the family home, for curating our art collection. This isn't just money. It's a foundation for his dreams. Then they turned to me. You, my father said, his tone shifting to one of what he probably thought was praise. You are so strong, so independent. You've never needed our help. You'll be fine. In fact, this should motivate you to reach even higher. The room seemed to tilt. My years of sacrifice, the student loans I'd paid off myself, the sleepless nights building a business they barely acknowledged. It all meant nothing. It was all just proof that I could be discarded. Daniel couldn't suppress a smug smile, leaning back in his chair as if he'd just been crowned. Hard work is its own reward, sis, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You wouldn't want to be burdened with all this managing and investing anyway. It's a weight I'm willing to bear for the family. I wanted to scream, to overturn the table, to force them to see the grotesque unfairness of it all. But the words stuck in my throat, choked by a lifetime of being the afterthought. The rest of the family looked on in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting anywhere but at me. I was utterly alone, humiliated in a room full of people who shared my blood. And then a sound cut through the stifling atmosphere. A dry, deliberate cough from the head of the table. All heads turned to my grandfather. He had been silent throughout the entire evening, a stoic, observant presence in his worn but impeccably tailored jacket. I had assumed he was bored or disengaged. But now his eyes were sharp, focused on my parents with an intensity that could strip paint. "I think," he said, his voice low and gravelly but carrying absolute authority, "that I have heard enough." My father started protest. "Father, this is a private family matter. It is a family disgrace," my grandfather interrupted, not raising his voice, but silencing my father instantly. He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a simple, leather-bound checkbook. The room held its breath. With agonizing slowness, he unscrewed the cap of his fountain pen and wrote, the scratch of the nib unnaturally loud. He tore out the check, stood, and walked a few steps to my chair. He placed a slip of paper in my trembling hand. "This is for you," he said, his voice resonating through the silent room. $2 million. A gift. Consider it an investment in the one member of this family who understands the meaning of the word. I looked down. The number was there in bold, black ink. 2 million. The zeros seemed to swim before my eyes. Daniel was the first to break. "What?" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "That's not fair. Why does she get that? What about me?" Grandfather turned his gaze on him, and for the first time I saw a flicker of pure contempt in his eyes. "Fair," he repeated, the word icy. "Let's talk about fair, then." He shifted his attention back to my parents. "For years, I have watched you coddle that boy," he said, jabbing a finger toward Daniel. "You've inflated his ego with hot air, while you ignored the daughter who was building something solid with her own 2 hands. You called it fragility. I call it incompetence. You called her strength independence. I call it character." My mother flushed a deep, mortified red. My father looked as if he'd been physically struck. "But she doesn't need it," my mother cried out, her voice shrill. "And he does." Grandfather shot back. "You have handed him everything, and in doing so, you have ensured he is capable of nothing. This ends now." He looked at me, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The money is yours. Use it to build the life you've earned, not the one they deigned to give you." The validation was a physical warmth, thawing the icy humiliation that had gripped me. Tears I had been fighting back finally spilled over. Daniel was sputtering, a mess of outrage and indignation. My parents tried to argue, to talk about family harmony, but their words were empty, exposed to the hypocrisy they were. The evening dissolved into chaos. Daniel had a full-blown tantrum, shouting about favoritism and manipulation. My parents pleaded with my grandfather, their voices rising in panic. Through it all, I sat clutching the check, a tangible anchor in the storm. Before he left, Grandpa placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't let their noise distract you," he said quietly, just to me. Then he was gone, leaving a void of stunned silence in his wake. The check felt heavy in my hand, a symbol of both vindication and severance. The question wasn't about the money itself, but about what it represented. Could I take it? Should I? A week passed, and the silence from my family was deafening. They hadn't called, and I hadn't reached out. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache. The memory of their dismissal replayed in my mind, each time reinforcing the chasm that had always existed. I was in my small, tidy apartment, trying to lose myself in work, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, I saw my grandfather standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out a place in my modest hallway. I opened the door, and he stepped inside without a word, his sharp eyes taking in the space. The shelves lined with books on coding and business, the single, healthy orchid on the coffee table, the absence of any frivolous luxury. "Just wanted to see how you were holding up," he said finally, his voice softer than it had been at the dinner. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "I'm managing," I said, my voice rough with unshed emotion. "It's a lot to process." He nodded, an understanding look in his eyes. "I should have spoken up years ago," he said, a note of regret in his voice. I saw the pattern. I thought if I stayed out of it, they might eventually see sense on their own. That was my mistake. "You didn't have to do what you did," I replied, "but thank you." It wasn't about the money. It was about being seen. "That's precisely why I did it," he said. "You can't spend your life seeking approval from people who have none to give. Your worth isn't defined by their blindness. This money," he gestured vaguely, "it's a tool. It's a chance that you define your own future on your own terms. Don't be afraid of it." I confess my biggest fear. What if I mess it up? What if I make a mistake? He gave a small, genuine smile. "Then you'll learn from it. That's what you do. You don't let the fear of failure paralyze you. You're smarter than that. Take your time. Get a good financial advisor. I can recommend a few. Think about what you truly want, not what you think you should want or what they would want you to want. What you want." We talked for another hour. He spoke about investments, about trusts, about the power of compound interest. But more importantly, he spoke about purpose. He encouraged me to think about expanding my business, about mentoring others, about finding a cause I was passionate about. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a lonely struggle. It felt like a landscape of possibilities. As he left, he turned at the door. "I've always been proud of you," he said, his voice firm. "Never forget that." The words settled deep inside me, a balm on a wound I had thought was permanent. For months later, the fallout was becoming public knowledge. Daniel, now in full control of my parents' estate, was proving every one of my grandfather's criticisms correct. The news trickled in through the family grapevine, a slow-motion train wreck I observed from a safe distance. He had immediately set about modernizing the family's portfolio, which apparently meant liquidating stable, long-term investments to fund a series of ill-conceived ventures. He decided the family home, a classic Georgian revival, needed a deconstructivist wing. He hired a famous, notoriously expensive architect who presented plans that were more sculpture than livable space. The budget was blown in the first month. He poured money into a startup founded by his friends, a company with a vague business plan involving blockchain-based artisanal snack curation. It was a spectacular failure. He sold off a portion of my mother's heirloom jewelry to cover the losses, claiming it was uninspired and holding its value back. My parents, true to form, were his chief enablers. They made excuses, telling concerned relatives that Daniel was a visionary and that true innovation always faces initial resistance. They blamed cautious financial advisors and unimaginative market conditions. But the cracks were showing. Whispers turned into concerned conversations. Business partners who had worked with my father for decades began quietly distancing themselves. The family's reputation, once built on a perception of solid, unshakable stability, was rapidly crumbling. I heard from a cousin that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on a house to cover Daniel's spiraling debts. They were trying to maintain the facade, still throwing small, strained parties, but the strain was evident. The laughter was forced, the conversations hushed. I felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was an undeniable, bitter satisfaction in seeing the consequences of their favoritism play out so disastrously. But it was overshadowed by a profound sadness. This was the family legacy they had chosen. A hollowed-out shell of what it once was, all to feed the bottomless ego of their favorite son. I had my own life to focus on. With my grandfather's guidance, I had invested a large portion of the money, set up a charitable foundation for STEM education for girls, and was planning a strategic expansion of my company. Their circus was no longer my concern. The descent accelerated. Daniel's grand visions had devolved into pure panic-driven decisions. He fired the expensive architect mid-construction, leaving a half-built monstrosity of steel and glass grafted onto the historic home, and then sued for breach of contract, a lawsuit he was almost certain to lose. The artisanal snack startup collapsed, taking another several $100,000 with it. The inevitable finally happened. The creditors, no longer willing to accept promises, began calling in their loans. Lawsuits were filed. The glossy veneer was stripped away, revealing the rotten core beneath. The call came on a Tuesday evening. My mother's name flashed on my phone screen. I hadn't spoken to her since the dinner. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was a masterpiece of delusion and passive aggression. Darling, her voice was thin, strained. I hope you're well. Things here are complicated. Daniel is working so hard to sort it all out. We always knew you were so capable. We always thought, if things ever got truly difficult, that we could count on you. Your family, after all, you have those resources now. Perhaps you could see your way to helping? It would mean so much. The audacity was breathtaking. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of their actions, just a naked assumption that my success was now a family asset they could tap into, despite having explicitly told me I deserved nothing. The guilt trip was as transparent as it was pathetic. I didn't respond. Then Daniel called. I listened to his voicemail. "Sis," he began, his voice a whine. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry for everything. I was under a lot of pressure. This is all just too much. You have to help. You're the older sister. It's your responsibility to look out for me. The estate, it's too big for me. If you could just, talk to Grandpa, or maybe just help with the payments for a while. We're family. We have to stick together." The manipulation was even more blatant. Responsibility. Family. Words they had defined to suit themselves for my entire life. This time, I picked up when he called again. "Do you really think," I asked, my voice cold and level, "that after everything, I have any obligation to clean up the mess you created?" He stammered. "It's not like that. We're family. You can't just turn your back." "I can and I am," I said. "I remember what you told me, that I should be motivated to work harder, that I didn't need the burden. Well, now it's your burden, so work harder. But you have the money, just sitting there," he cried, his entitlement laid bare. "And I earned every cent of it, not through your kind of inheritance, but through my grandfather's belief in my character, a concept you clearly don't understand," I replied. "I am not your safety net. I am not your backup plan. You made your choices. You live with them." I hung up. The calls continued for a few days, from my mother, from my father, even from an aunt I barely knew, all singing the same tune of familial duty. I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed was not empty. It was peaceful. The final act was orchestrated by my grandfather. He summoned the entire family to his austere, book-lined study. The atmosphere was funereal. My parents looked aged and defeated, their fine clothes hanging loosely on them. Daniel was erect, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. I took a seat, feeling calm and detached. The outcome of this meeting no longer held any power over me. Grandfather stood before his massive oak desk, his posture rigid. "I've called you here because the farce is over," he began, his voice cold and clear. "I have watched this family devour itself from the inside out through a combination of stupidity, weakness, and sheer greed." He let the words hang in the air. No one dared to speak. "Your actions," he said, looking directly at my parents, "have been a masterclass in failure. You didn't just show favoritism. You actively crippled one child while enabling the other into uselessness. You were given a legacy, and you have set on fire to keep your golden boy warm for a single fleeting moment. My mother began to weep, but these were tears of shame, not grief. And you, he turned to Daniel, his gaze withering, you are a testament to their failure. You were given everything, and you have nothing to show for it but debt and disgrace. Daniel flinched as if struck. I have been too lenient, grandfather continued. I believed in allowing people to make their own mistakes. But this is no longer a mistake. It is a catastrophe of your own making. Therefore, I am amending my will effective immediately. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk. Your inheritance, he said to my parents, is revoked. Every last cent. It will be redirected into a trust, the details of which are none of your concern. The gasp from my mother was sharp. My father looked as if he might be sick. Daniel stared, his mouth agape, his last hope visibly extinguished. You can't do this. Daniel finally blurted out, his voice trembling with rage and fear. I can, and I have, grandfather replied icily. You have proven yourself incapable of handling anything of value. You have squandered not just money, but respect, trust, and the very concept of family. Consider this the final lesson your parents failed to teach you. Actions have consequences. My parents tried to plead, to apologize, their words a jumble of self-pity and desperation. They claimed they never meant for it to go this far, that they were sorry for how they treated me. But their apologies were for the consequence, the loss of their future inheritance, not for the action itself. Their eyes, when they flicked to me, still held a flicker of resentment. They were sorry they were getting caught, not sorry for what they had done. Grandfather was unmoved. You have made your bed. Now you must lie in it. 2 days later, I received a long, rambling email from my parents. It was full of florid apologies and pleas for forgiveness, begging for a chance to reconcile. They spoke of family bonds and second chances. I read it once, then deleted it. I had forgiven them, not for their sake, but for my own. Forgiveness was the act of setting down a heavy burden I had carried for too long. But forgiveness did not mean reinstatement. It did not mean forgetting. It meant I was finally, truly free. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady purpose. The future my grandfather had helped me secure was no longer just a financial one. It was an emotional and spiritual one. I was no longer the overlooked daughter, the independent one who didn't need anything. I was the architect of my own destiny. And for the first time, the blueprint was entirely my own.